Hi, and welcome back to the Church Renewal podcast from Flourish Coaching. I'm your host, Alan Edwards, and we're dropping in your feed today with one of our special listener question episodes. We put out on Facebook and Twitter to our friends and to our colleagues that we're starting this podcast, and we just basically said, what do you want to talk about when it comes to the renewal and revitalization of churches? I've got Matt Bowling, Flourish's executive director, here with me today, and we're looking forward to digging into some of these. We'd love for you to join the conversation with us. So you can reach us by email. I'm alan@flourishcoaching.org. That's ALLAN. You can reach our director, Matt, at flourishcoaching.org by email as well. You can always connect to us on Facebook at tinyurl.com/flourishfb or on Twitter, flourishcoach1. That's flourishcoach and the number 1. Share your thoughts and questions, and maybe you'll be featured on a future episode here of the podcast. Flourish exists to set ministry leaders free with the gospel so that they can be effective wherever God has called them. When pastors or churches feel stuck, our coaches come alongside them to renew their hope and help them gain strategic clarity. All right, let's dig in and explore the ways that Jesus is renewing his church. So we're back on the Church Renewal podcast doing listener and colleague questions and interactions. Last time on this series of episodes, you heard us talk a little bit about helpful resources and unhelpful aspects of those resources because Kirk in Martinsville, West Virginia asked us to interact with that. Kirk also asked us to interact a little bit with, he mentions some of the stuff that's coming out of the Evangelical Presbyterian Church's Go Center and their work with revitalizations. But I'd like, Matt, if you don't mind, we jump off and talk a little bit more broadly about what denominations are doing in revitalization. So I've got Matt here. He's the executive director of Flourish Coaching. Matt, what do you know about what the EPC is doing, and what are other denominations doing in this space?
Yeah, so one of the privileges of being the director of a ministry like Flourish is that I get to have interaction and build relationship and work on par with denominational leaders in a broad spectrum of denominations. And so the EPC's Go Center is staffed by a guy named Ken Pretty, who happened to be one of the very first teachers that I ever had in revitalization. I can remember the first seminar I ever went to of his years and years ago. And so Ken has done great work over the years with several different denominations, several different evangelical denominations. And so you can see some of his videos, in fact, on YouTube. And so just look up Go Center or Ken Pretty, Priddy, and it's useful. Ken not only has the YouTube videos, but we have, and we'll link in the show notes, a very useful article that he wrote some years ago on church life cycle. And the work that we do at Flourish on church life cycle had its genesis actually in something that I learned from Ken. I'm sure I built on it, and maybe he wouldn't like everything that I do with it. But anyways, he was my first teacher in that idea of church life cycle. There's a variety of evangelical denominations that are working in church renewal because it's just the broad need of the day. So I'll give a few examples of stuff that I've run into out there in my travels. The Christian Reformed Church has a ministry that of a pastor who's among them. It's not an official work of the CRC itself, but it's out of one of their seminaries.
Is that Calvin Seminary?
Calvin Seminary, yeah. Church Renewal Lab is an aspect of Church Renewal Center. I think Keith Dornbos is the director of that, doing really, really neat work. The RCA and the CRC actually have a partnership. They were given a large grant by the DeVos Family Foundation.
For our listeners, RCA is Reformed Church in America, CRC, Christian Reformed Church. Go ahead.
They were given a large grant for a Reformed partnership for church renewal. And so there's sort of a clearinghouse for church renewal for those two families of churches. I have a relationship where I live in Seattle with the Christian Missionary Alliance in our area. The last time I checked, they have 100 churches in their district and 70 of them are in need of revitalization. So it's just a vital thing for them. The SBC friend that I have, Southern Baptist Convention friend that I have out by me, Southern Baptist Convention, very active in church renewal. In fact, they sponsor Rainer's podcast
on Revitalize Replant.
And Revitalize Replant because they're interested in seeing churches come back to health as well as new churches be planted. What am I forgetting now? And I know I'm forgetting at least.
Well,
So we've had the opportunity to work with the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church, older denomination, mostly in the Southeast.
older meaning they've been around a very long time.
Yeah, they've been around for a really long time.
Yeah.
Like 1700 is a long time. And they have an intentional program that 1-year program they take churches through, and we've been privileged to partner with them.
They're using a book, or they're using a methodology called Framing the Future of Your Church and Ministry.
Right.
And so it's kind of programmatic, but they kind of layer that with some relationship and some coaching. They've got a church vitality coach as part of their team.
Yep, as part of their team. And they use very helpful book, little complex, I think, for most people, but helpful book, Church Unique by Will Mancini. They use as sort of the core of what they're doing, which leads us a little bit. Maybe we'll talk about, you want to talk about Pastor Unique a little bit?
Yeah, so the ARP is using Church Unique by Will Mancini. And when we first met them, we got in this kind of confusing conversation because there's a resource that we're familiar with called Pastor Unique from a group called Turnaround Pastors. And so not a denomination, but another group that is kind of working in this space. Would you talk a little bit about what a Pastor Unique is and how it speaks to this issue?
Yeah, so Turnaround Pastors is 3 guys that gathered together really around some research, trying to figure out what's a renewal pastor look like. And so you can read Pastor Unique and you can see what the results of their research is. These have become friends, ministry colleagues, and we link to their different resources in some of our other podcasts because we find their material so helpful. They run something that I hope that someday either we'll partner with them or we'll create our own. They actually run a renewal pastor boot camp, which is great because you can just go for 4 days and learn some of the basic skills that you need in terms of turning around a church. Not a program again, but the development of the pastor himself to be a leader. One of the other interesting things, and we'll probably talk about this more in other spaces, there's another ministry that we've had a relationship with called Vital Church. They're a spinoff of CRM in Illinois.
CRM is?
Church Resource Ministries, but they were a collection of a lot of different kinds of ministries. But Vital Church does 2 things extraordinarily well, probably the best that I've seen, which is they do these very full church health assessments. We do a more simplified version of what they do, but they do these really wonderful church health assessments. They'll bring a whole team into a church. I've done this a couple of times with them, and they really do these tremendously good assessments, particularly because they have a very large data set because they've done a lot of them, and so they can kind of compare churches across time and across topics. The other thing they do really well is that they do intentional interim pastoring. And that's a topic that we'll probably explore in some depth in a different podcast. But this is a space in church renewal that, in my opinion, is underexplored. Evangelical churches typically use interim pastors at an extraordinarily low rate. And I think that should be very, very different than it is.
And their interims tend to be caretakers.
Yes.
Which a church that's been through a crisis needs some good care.
They need loving. Yep.
But Vital Churches uses an intentional interim. To go back to the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, they've been working to shift their philosophy of interim. They call them now transitional pastors who are pursuing an intentional change agent model of interim, doing interim. And so that's happening in a couple places. Vital Church outside of denominations, the EPC, I know they're working to do that within their denomination.
And even a ministry that's been around for a while, Interim Pastor Ministries, IPM, they're trying to develop more to where maybe in the beginning they did a lot of those caretaker sorts of ministries, just a pastor that would come in the interim between pastors and preach and care for people and just kind of keep things going while the search committee was going. They're trying to move even more towards the other end of the spectrum in terms of interim ministry or transitional ministry, to where there's a far greater degree of intentionality towards what they're going for.
Yeah.
We've actually got this opportunity with a couple of churches, right?
Yeah.
Where they've brought in kind of a pastor, interim pastor part-time. We've done this a couple of times with churches. We're doing one right now, and we're just in contract negotiations with another one where they'll bring in a pastor part-time to do sort of preaching and care and liturgy and things like that. But they've hired us basically to do all of the strategy stuff. And so we'll do church health assessment for them. We'll help them recapture a vision for their church. And then based on that recaptured vision, we'll help them find a pastor that can take them where they want to go to.
So before we close out this kind of discussion about what ministries and denominations are doing in and around renewal, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about our mother, which is the Presbyterian Church in America. And really, just as a small artifact, would you mind telling the story, Matt, about the new national coordinator for church planting and home missions? So in the PCA, they call that Mission to North America, which is just kind of known in our denomination as being the church planting guys.
Sure.
But there's an interesting artifact there around renewal, if you don't mind sharing the story.
So Flourish started in 2014 because three pastors in the PCA were coaching people, and we decided to get together. So I was one of those three. Another guy, Ted Strawbridge, who actually was the main genesis behind Flourish being started, actually sadly went to be with the Lord this year. Not sad for him, sad for us, because we don't have him any longer. The third was Paul Hahn, who later became the national coordinator for M&A. When I first met Paul, the first conversation that I ever had with him, I knew his name because he's well known in our circles, but I'd never met him before. The first conversation that we had with him, his local presbytery, this is long before he was asked to consider becoming the coordinator for M&A. The first conversation I had with him, he was just leaving a church that he planted, and his presbytery was asking him to come help them plant some churches and to consider that. And he counter-proposed them and said, well, I've been in this presbytery for a while. I think what our presbytery actually needs is efforts in both planting and renewal. So how about if you call me as the pastor for church planting and church renewal for this presbytery? To the best of my knowledge, in my research, that's the first time that ever happened. That a leader of that caliber was going to lead in a presbytery in both planting and renewal. And then a couple of years after that conversation, Paul was asked to apply to become the national coordinator for M&A. And then he brought that same heart with him into what he does at M&A. And so now M&A does church planting. They do these missional partnerships, disaster response, ESL, lots of other things that are not coming to my mind or off the top of my head. But they've added church renewal as a third leg of the stool. And so we're privileged to partner with M&A in those efforts, and we're excited to see what the Lord's going to do through time there.
So a lot of things that are happening across lots of denominations around church renewal, church revitalization, and that's exciting. You
Absolutely.
know, I can remember you telling me once that 25 years ago, when certain tip of the spear thinkers about revitalization, like Harry Reeder, were prophets in the wilderness, nobody was listening to them, and now here we are, evangelical churches really realizing that we need to invest here. If you, our listeners, are aware of efforts that are happening across churches, ministries, denominations that you'd recommend, we'd love to hear from you. So please reach out to us. You can reach our executive director at Flourish over email, matt@flourishcoaching.org. You can reach me, Alan, at flourishcoaching.org. Interact with our Facebook page, tinyurl.com/flourishfb. If you want to help expand this conversation about church renewal, please like, subscribe, comment on, leave a review, and share this podcast with your friends and your peers in ministry and in churches. There's a driving reason that Flourish wants to keep the conversation about renewal going, and it's this. We believe there's only one fully sufficient reason that this day dawned. Jesus is still gathering a people to himself, and he uses the church to do it. So please join us as we pray for the renewal of our churches and as we dig into the ways that Jesus is renewing his church.